I wanted to ask. Today, the 12th in inversion marathon started, where you appeared with the host, right? With the host from The Economists. What key points of the macroeconomic forecast do you plan to present in the coming days? Well, I don't even know. The thing is, I'm actually going to talk about something a little different. Yeah. So, what's the main issue here, right? This is really kind of a general problem for all of modern economic science and finance too. What kind of world are we living in? I've been describing the world from my own perspective for 25 years now. Basically, I've more or less accurately described all the crises that have happened during that time. We described the crisis of 2001, which was formally linked to the September 11th attacks, but in reality, it was an economic crisis. We described the crisis of 2008. We described the crisis of 2014. And by and large, we've actually described the whole picture pretty accurately. Moreover, time and again, the things we talked about, which supporters of orthodox liberal theory disagreed with, are later confirmed after the fact. The problem is that this hasn't stopped them from believing that there's nothing beyond liberal theory. And that's why they're fundamentally inadequate. And for that reason, it's practically impossible to have a conversation with them. What can you even talk about with people who just repeat mantras that clearly don't match reality? Moreover, if you look at what the current leaders of the United States are saying, you'll see that they've already, implicitly, oh, sorry, I'm really tired today, they've already, in a way, incorporated this crisis into their logic, their actions, and so on. But the problem is that they still can't explain it. And the people who are supposed to explain it either dodge the issue or say it's nonsense. In reality, it's actually completely different. So what should we do about this? The day before yesterday, I met with some people who follow you very closely, Mikhail. For some reason, they're all convinced that you know and see much more than you actually share. They attribute Freemasonry, Jesuitism, and all sorts of other things to you, and say that Mikhail in general, someone told me. A pretty smart person said, we actually think that Mikhail isn't even from this planet. And what he knows, he just doesn't tell us, because no one would understand anyway. How do you feel about that? Well, you see, in a way, that's a kind of defense mechanism. I mean, when someone says something, how should I put this? Yeah, I've experienced this myself. When I was just starting out and explaining all this, people would tell me, Misha, we agree with your conclusion, but the logic you're using is nonsense. So, clearly, you must have some other motives, or maybe you have some kind of special knowledge. Well, it doesn't really matter, right? It could be Masonic, Jesuit, or something else entirely. Moldovan or Moldovan Jewish, whatever. Chinese, it really doesn't matter at all, because it doesn't line up with science. That's not how it works in science. You know, at first I tried to explain to them, like, guys, your science doesn't match the current reality. No, it did match reality for several decades, at least. Although even then, there were all sorts of nuances. But today, it absolutely doesn't fit anymore. But the problem is that the people who live in this science just can't let it go. You see, Steve, this is a fundamental and very important thing. You know, any science today is about institutions. You get what I mean? You have to go to some institution and get a diploma. If you go around telling the professors they're idiots, you won't get that diploma. If you don't get a diploma, then any arguments you make on this subject, from the perspective of those who do have a diploma, are seen as fraud, like you're a con artist or something like that. That's exactly what they told me. Even now, yeah, in the official, so to speak, federal document called Wikipedia, there were wild debates about whether it was okay to say that I'm an economist. So, moving on, point 2. Next, let me point this out. If you want to get a diploma, you have to choose a scientific advisor. And then you have to live up to the expectations of that advisor. At the same time, you end up in a system that, in the Soviet Army, was called Didoshina, hazing by the seniors.
I've done.
So, when you're in your third year, you have to, at Moscow University, you would choose your scientific advisor in your second year. And starting from your third year, you're supposed to become more senior, right? You have to help the upperclassmen and graduate students, write things for them, and so on, though, no, that doesn't necessarily mean they steal your results, although that does happen too. But usually, it's the advisors who steal the results. There are plenty of precedents for that.
Okay.
So, then, you keep moving along this path, especially if you continue further. So, if you keep working within this system, if you keep writing papers, if you're aiming for a Hirsch index, even though I still don't know what that is.
Well, you're aiming for it. Yeah. You're aiming for it, not knowing what it is, aiming.
I don't know what it is. I mean, of course, I could look it up on the internet, sure, but it doesn't really mean anything to me, because for people who actually keep track of these indexes, they know exactly. If you publish an article in this journal, it's better than if you publish in that one or whatever. All of that is completely out of my reach. People who have calculated my Hirsch index say it's somewhere around 14. I have no idea what that even means.
14 is good. That's pretty good.
Yeah, but it's not 30, for example. I don't know if that's good or bad. What does it mean? But it doesn't matter to me because I'm not part of that community.
Or maybe those people just haven't reached that level yet. A lot of what we're telling them, many of them are already quite mature.
Let me say something. Before, things were simple for them. They used to say the following: those who make the decisions, we pay experts money. And for us, the experts who can tell us something reasonable are the ones who really matter.
Other.
Of course, there are also some separate topics. Those are basically friendly institutions, right? The ones we pay, and they give us kickbacks. But let's not get into that for now. The ones who can actually tell us something. As long as we're satisfied with these, we don't need any new ones. Maybe you guys are saying everything right, but for now, we just don't need you. And, this went on for quite a while. Then at some point, it became clear that these so-called experts were completely useless. They were just talking nonsense.
Complete.
Complete, yes. At the same time, the people who were supposed to be making decisions, actually, the first ones to make decisions weren't the governments or government officials, but the IMF. This was reflected in the book Bretton Woods, The Next 70 Years, published under the editorship and auspices of the IMF, with a foreword by Christine Lagarde, who was the managing director at the time. The idea was for those people who were considered capable of saying something about the crisis to actually say something. So, from Russia, 3 people were basically allowed to submit their essays there. Those were Russell and Grinberg, the director of the Institute of Economics of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Guriev,
Other.
Sergei Guriev, and me. At that moment, it became clear that, accordingly, they understood that something was wrong. Let me repeat, not scientists. The IMF is a governing body
Yes.
of the Bretton Woods system, so to speak. So, after that, at the same time, the level of animosity toward me in the academic community only grew because I started to be seen as a threat. Before that, in their eyes, I was just a harmless eyeball. Well, fine. There are some people running around here talking about torsion fields. But can you build a power plant that generates electricity on an industrial scale from torsion fields? No? Well then, sorry. But here, something serious started happening. They actually got scared. For real.
Of course they did.
Exactly. And then, naturally, they started writing nasty things and all sorts of stuff back and forth in all kinds of directions, you know? Nasty things ranging from accusing me of anti Semitism and other stuff. You get what I mean, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what label it is. The important thing is to stick a label on you.
To stick a label, yeah. It doesn't matter what people think about it. I've already said that.
Yeah. Exactly. And accordingly, I've seen this happen many times in all sorts of different ways. That's right. Since I'm a Russian citizen and I have a position on this that aligns with my country's interests, there are more than enough reasons for people to come after me in conversations. Supported Russian aggression in Ukraine, and then, bam. Even though for many years before that, I explained, that Ukraine's policies were deliberately
Leads.
leading to this. I explained why. I explained how. Why?
And that Zelensky himself brought this war with his own hands.
Well, at this point it doesn't even matter anymore, right? All of this started way earlier, before Zelensky. Exactly. There were two coups d'etat that destroyed the state system, and so on and so forth. You get it? So, it's like the Orange Revolution is considered legitimate when it was when it was organized by the West. But if it's anti-Western, then it's illegal, right? But of course, that's just a position, but it really doesn't have anything to do with anything. And most importantly, if you call a political event legitimate just because it's approved by the powers that be, then you're automatically putting yourself at risk. If those in power suddenly change, you have no rights at all. What can you do? The powerful have spoken. That's it. Goodbye. Have a walk. Vazia.
Okay, yes. Mikhail Yakovlevich, look, the marathon participants are discussing exchange rates, investments in gold, real estate, and bank deposits. Given the current global risks, which assets do you personally consider the most promising, and why?
Steve, by the way, let me remind you, yes, the book about gold becoming one of the main assets. Andrei Kobikov and I wrote it back in 2002 to 2003. It was published 22 years ago. Back then, and for many years after, all those so-called experts accused us of being idiots. And
Well,
there you go. So, I'm not going to talk right now about which assets are the best. Because I've held, paid webinars where I explain what to do with your savings. And accordingly, I don't think it's right, to share for free what?
I agree. Then use a question. Look, Fanversia is holding Ruble Day on July 1st. What measures to support the national currency would you recommend the Russian government take?
I'm not going to give any advice to the Russian government today. The thing is, how should I put this? It only makes sense to give advice when someone actually asks you for it, right? And today, not only is no one asking me, I don't even see anyone in the current financial and economic team who could actually do that. Moreover, sort of going against my own instincts, watched the discussion that took place at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum with those very same Russian financial and economic leaders. They made an unforgettable impression on me. What?
You really have to watch it. I mean, guys, what are you even talking about? It honestly reminded me of a certain scene. Yeah, like people just sitting in a bar. Just sitting there, having drinks, enjoying themselves. And then suddenly, someone comes up to them and says, guys, there's this thing. You need to step outside. There's who's gathered at the gate?
The people.
The people. You need to go out there and show everyone that you're in control of the situation and that you understand the economy. He says, but we're just, what? Oh, come on. What does it matter? People won't understand anything anyway. You just need to say the words. So they went out and said the words. That's it. So basically, again, I'm saying this, let's get into the weeds, which you don't really like. Or maybe you do like it, I don't know. You recently discussed the tension in the Iran-Israel conflict. In your opinion, what events in the Middle East could impact global and Russian financial markets?
Listen, here's the main issue, right? We're not going to discuss what happened there right now. First of all, because there's a lot we don't know, and second, because some things look like an absolute setup, like a total arrangement.
Yeah, then there were recent strikes on American military bases. Excuse us, but we're going to be shooting here. If you see planes, just hide your soldiers. We'll launch a couple of rockets, and they won't even reach their targets.
So what difference does it make?
Or maybe they'll reach, but just not where they're supposed to.
Come on, is this the first time this has happened? What did Trump do when he struck Russia in 2017? It was exactly the same, right? We're about to hit. Be careful.
The only thing that surprised me was when Trump started cursing live on air yesterday. He was clearly really angry. You could see it on his face. He was really angry.
That's because he had already made all the deals. He had established peace. But these moles are trying to stir things up. They want war.
Trump, he always spoke harshly, but for him to use even mild swear words on air like that, I've never seen that before. He was angry.
You know, there's this little folk song. You should know it, considering your dad's profession. Yeah, peace, peace, no need for war. That's the motto of the Friendship Squad.
Friendship.
So, Trump.
If the motherland calls, the Grenado Squad has an answer, right?
Yeah.
That's childhood. That's childhood.
That's exactly how it is. But now look, okay?
Especially, you know, when he used to say, pioneers, be ready, always ready. And the pioneers of Tatarstan would go, all right. Lifter.
So what's the whole problem? The thing is, Trump made a deal. But the trouble is, there are a lot of forces that don't want peace.
Of course.
And not just in the United States, but also in Israel, in Iran, and most of all, in London. And they are deliberately undermining Trump's policies. That's why Trump is furious. I mean, it was said, that's it, Iran's nuclear industry has been destroyed. Shut up.
Yeah.
Here. But then people respond, no, it wasn't destroyed. You missed. Back and forth. Apparently, Netanyahu was talked to, and today he said, no, they hid everything. There's no more Iranian nuclear industry. He got the message. You know, nobody really cares. What matters is that there's no war.
Yeah, right.
At the same time, everyone understands perfectly well that if this war keeps going, it's more likely that Israel will disappear than Iran. But right now, let's not talk about those people sitting in Israel who, you have to understand, for them it's kind of an existential thing, right? They just can't admit that Israel could lose. You see, for them, it's just impossible. You get it, for them, it's everything, right? Their sense of security on that land is basically the key.
Well, to be fair, Iran has also had some very critical, really serious moments in its history.
Iran has had some very critical moments. And actually, on the very first day when the attack started, Iran,
It kind of faded a bit.
until about, 5:30, 6 o'clock, it was basically left without any authority.
And do you know why? Because you know what happened? On the one hand, it's not really clear. Trump promised if there are negotiations, there will be war. They believed him.
Listen, but he got tricked, right? It's like both Trump got tricked too, and we saw how Netanyahu twisted Trump's arm so that he.
Really hard.
Exactly, and that's betrayal, right? I don't think Trump will forget that.
He won't forget.
Exactly, on the one hand. But on the other hand, well, did Trump know that there was going to be a strike? No, he was probably warned shortly before it happened. But I'm not at all sure that he deliberately deceived the Iranians. And if he did deceive them, then in that case, both Iran and the whole world understand that you can't do business with Trump. You see, that's a whole different world.
Okay, so here's the question. Look, the media has been talking about a theory regarding the collapse of the dollar system and the decline of the US's geopolitical influence. How likely is that scenario, and what does it mean for investment strategies?
Listen, our book from 2003 was called The Decline of the Dollar Empire and the End of America. So, we wrote 22 years ago that this was inevitable.
Inevitable, I remember that.
It follows from the economic nature of the processes that are taking place. Well, what are we talking about then? Step. You get it? The whole idiocy is that all of them, and this just blows my mind, they suddenly started looking at these events, which we not only described, but actually developed a theory for, proved it with numbers, with graphs, and so on, and so forth. Now they're looking at it as if it's, like a tsunami, right? Or an explosion at Yellowstone, for example.
That's a,
Something that was absolutely inevitable, for quite a long time now, and something that, in general, can be more or less clearly described how it will happen and what will happen. They treat as some kind of unexpected event, like a volcano erupting at Yellowstone.
yeah, I agree.
You see what I mean? So, what's the point of talking to them? For the same reason, when they start talking about investments or something else. Guys, can you please tell me what the demand will be? You get it? They say, what do you mean? Well, like before. The markets will crash, then there will be chaos, and then. I tell them, guys, read the book, check when it was published, and in that book it says that demand will drop by at least half, and actually even more in the United States. So how are you planning to manage an economy where demand has fallen by half? And so on and so forth. There's a lot more that could be said on this topic. I've written quite a bit about it myself. By the way, I've basically finished the second edition of Memoirs of the Future. So, it'll probably come out in the fall.
That's a,
Unless there's a crash before then. But what difference does it make? There's going to be a crash anyway. This will last a long time. It's all written there for you, basically.
yeah, I agree with you.
The first edition was published in 1919, 6 years ago.
Yes, yeah.
Well, by now we should be used to the fact that it's all written down. Moreover, I'm not even afraid to say it. This book has been translated into American English, and not just once. The first time was about 4 years ago, and it wasn't done very well. But the second time, about a year ago, it was translated successfully. So go ahead and read it. Everything is written there.
Look,
They don't want to read. And do you know why they don't want to read? Because they have institutions. And in those institutions, they are their own authorities. A book is considered good if it references those authorities.
I see.
You see, and it said that those authorities are right. But if a book doesn't reference those authorities and basically says that what those authorities claim is nonsense, then it's considered a bad book. I just know stories. Like at Novosibirsk University, there was this top student, and, on the economics faculty, maybe in his fourth year or even already in graduate school. I can't remember exactly. It's been a while since I heard this story. He asked, "Why don't you let us read Khazin's book?" And right away, he almost got a failing grade on his next economics exam, and as a result, he lost his top student status, right? Why? Because it's taboo. But if I'm taboo, and the theory is taboo, then how can you explain what's going on? That's why there's a sharp conflict. Notice, scientists aren't invited into the government. Well, with one exception, here. That's the Institute of National Economic Forecasting. Got it. There's Sasha Sheriff, the director, whom I've known since practically when he was a grad student under my friend Murat Yuziakov. He's a practical guy, yes. He works with inter-industry balances. And he understands very well what's possible and what's not, but he knows what's going on. So that's the situation.
Mikhail Yakovlevich, here's the question. Economists are predicting an American-Russian-Chinese war. How likely do you think a large-scale conflict is, and what scenarios do you see for the world economy in that case? How likely is it that they could come into direct confrontation?
Look, nobody has time for that. There just aren't any resources, So, look, right? What did Iran show us? It struck several American bases. Yeah, it's like they either didn't hit anything or only hit empty bases, or something like that. But they clearly demonstrated that if such a strike were carried out simultaneously on 5 or 6 bases, the Americans wouldn't be able to handle it. That's the point. And again, there's a lot we just don't know, right? For example, experts tell me that there weren't any Israeli planes in the sky over Tehran.
Whose planes were they?
There were missiles, there were drones, but there were no planes.
American planes?
I don't know. There just weren't any planes there. That's not me saying it. That's what experts say. I'm not a specialist in this area.
Okay.
Right. So it's all pretty complicated. I'm not that much of an expert actually, I'm not an expert at all on these defense issues.
You recently called Donald Trump the main loser in the Iran-Israel conflict. What do you see as Trump's tragic mistake?
You see? It's that he wasn't able to, keep things under control. Netanyahu was clearly working for London. Yeah, Trump failed to maintain his authority in the eyes of Iran. The strike happened right in the middle of negotiations. That's it. And finally, it's like he was forced into it. They twisted his arm and made him launch the strike. He clearly didn't want to. Yeah, he tried to resist, but they twisted his arm. So he showed a certain weakness. That's it. Moreover, it became clear that he can't even play on 2 fronts anymore, in Ukraine and in the Middle East. It became clear that the forces wanting to start a major war in the Middle East will most likely be able to do it. Here, I can only add
Okay.
that, why is this bad? Because if Trump leaves the Middle East, if he's forced to, it will be very difficult and unpleasant. What kind of confrontation with China can we even talk about in this situation? Guys, deal with this first. You've got everything here, supposedly obedient regimes that actually don't listen at all, military bases, and everything else, and still nothing works out. So how do you expect to fight China in this situation?
I have the right.
Steve, I get it. Yeah, that I'm kind of rambling on.
You're absolutely right.
Exactly. But I want to tell you that, in a way, this isn't Trump's fault. Yeah, he has his own unique management style, but the real problem is that the system itself is falling apart. Do you understand? It's impossible to manage a complex system relying solely on your own resources. Your ally is a person, or maybe a country, or a force that helps you out of their own interests. In other words, they use their own resources, including intellectual ones, to do your work for you. Instead of sending planes and bombing your enemies, you call your allies and they handle the issue in their own way, including, really understanding the local nuances.
Okay.
By the way, that's exactly what the British are doing right now. This is something Trump just can't do today. Why? Because the tools he used to make friendship with the United States beneficial for many of its allies have objectively stopped working. Not because Trump is weak, although some of those tools have definitely weakened, but simply because, objectively, those tools just aren't there anymore. They don't work now. The economy has changed so much, and so on and so forth. They can be created again, but that would require enormous effort, a lot of time, and most importantly, you need to understand what this new model will look like.